All right, good day everyone. Welcome to the DOE Fuel Cell Technologies Office monthly webinar series. Today's installment is titled the Energy Materials Network Lab Consortia Overview. My name is Chris Worth and I am the organizer for this meeting. We'll begin shortly, but first I have a few housekeeping items to tell you about. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording along with the slides will be posted to our EERE website in about 10 days. We will send out an email to attendees once those are posted to the site. Next slide, Eric. All attendees will be on mute throughout the webinar, so please submit your questions via the question box that you should see on your webinar panel. We will cover those questions during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. With that, I would like to introduce our DOE host and presenter, Eric Miller, joining us from the Department of Energy headquarters in Washington, D.C. Eric is the manager of the Hydrogen Production and Delivery Program within the Fuel Cell Technologies Office. It's a pleasure to have you, Eric. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for joining us today. I will be giving you an overview presentation on the Energy Materials Network, specifically related to some of the consortia that are being developed at the Fuel Cell Technologies Office. We have a series of webinars scheduled to go into more detail on those specific consortia scheduled this week and through the rest of the month. I'll put up a schedule of those webinars at the end of my presentation. My presentation will focus more on an overview of the EMN and how the consortium model is generally structured. I want to start out by calling out the Materials Genome Initiative, which many people are probably familiar with. It was a presidential initiative announced by President Obama back in 2011. And the great thing about the MGI, as we call it, is that this is a high-level recognition of the critical importance of materials research across many important industrial sectors. The goal, if you read the documentation for MGI, which we'll talk about on the next slide, was to really stimulate innovation in materials discovery and development with a very ambitious target of speeding up conventional materials to market processes by a factor of 2. Let me kind of get into that a little bit more about what's in the MGI, what's the foundations of MGI, and some of the pillars of the strategic plan for MGI. I want to highlight that numerous agencies contributed to the development of this strategic plan for the Materials Genome Initiative. On a very high level, they mapped out 4 key pillars, which I put on this slide. I'll just highlight them again. That maybe foremost is an integration of the state-of-the-art resources that really combine experiment, theory, and computation. That's second on this list here, but I think as from a scientist's point of view, that's kind of the overarching good science message for the MGI. Related to that, though, there's certainly important things that have to happen, including leading a cultural shift that really utilizes this type of integration effectively, leveraging resources and data generation. Big data is a big part of the MGI, making sure that that information is being curated and being disseminated to the public appropriately so that the scientists across the world, at least across the nation and across the world, can have better access to what the state-of-the-art is in their field. Training new generations, the world-class materials workforce is another major part of this, realizing that we can have the best tool sets in the world, best tool sets ever, without the expertise of the workforce. They're somewhat meaningless. None of these things are plug and play. I'll come back to that quite often to stress the importance of the materials expertise in the MGI and also in the EMN. Okay, I do want to now bridge into the Energy Materials Network, which was also kicked off at the White House a little bit later. That was this year, February 24th, 2016. This really was an attempt to leverage the great advances that the MGI had made over the past several years, but really to focus on clean energy technologies and applications, putting those tools to use in this area to really accelerate clean energy technologies to the marketplace a lot faster than we've been conventionally doing. Put this again in perspective of the MGI foundational pillars in addition to some new pillars that the EMN brings to the table. If we take a look at the left side, there's the MGI framework, the 4 pillars that I talked about, focused on a lot of important industrial sectors, including clean energy being one of them, but broadly speaking, looking at other things across the nation, across the world. If we look at applying these from a more applied perspective from the clean energy space, we realize that the EMN builds on the vision, but there's a need across the spectrum of clean energy technologies to look at the discovery and the development of materials all the way from the fundamental discovery stage all the way through the scale-up and qualification stages. These stages are really set by specific technology applications. We'll come back to that in a minute. It's very important to realize that the EMN looks at high-impact clean energy technologies and burrows down into the MGI toolset that's been developed to look for the most appropriate tools and capabilities that we can apply to solving these problems faster. So to accomplish this, what we're doing is we're looking at how do we assemble a comprehensive suite of state-of-the-art tools across the board in all the categories that I'm showing on the slide here. It's pretty ambitious, it's pretty broad, but keep in mind it's not only fundamental materials discovery from a computational and theoretical point of view. It really looks at what's needed for materials to scale up and what's needed for them to qualify into large-scale systems. I do want to come back to one point that this tool set is pretty impressive, what's been developed over the past several years through the scientific community. There's many things here, and one of the things I do want to point out is that the rapid increase of capabilities in combinatorial synthesis, combinatorial computation, rapid screening, high throughput screening, all of these things are part of the suite of the tool set that we'll be utilizing in the EMN. I do want to focus, though, that the real point is to accelerate the development to the marketplace of these materials and material systems into clean energy applications. One tool, it does not qualify it to be EMN. It's possible that you will be using no combinatorial synthesis tools in your suite for your particular application, but those are tools that are available to us that really have helped us move the ball faster today. All right, so taking a look again, this is what we're looking at when we're setting up the Energy Materials Network. We realize that if we look out to what's been developed over the past several years in terms of what's happened at the national laboratories in this area of MGI, we realize that there's a lot of world-class capabilities in state-of-the-art materials, experimentation, computation, theory, benchmarking, screening, all of the above. So the first step really is to look at what we've got out there in a distributed sense, not to have to start from scratch again, because the problems, if we really look in the broad sense of all the clean energy applications we want to address, it's very, very comprehensive and very broad. What we're doing then is initially started with a survey of what we've got at the national laboratories in terms of world-class capabilities in these areas, and how do we formulate those into a consortium model around specific energy applications that can then help us move forward in developing these things in the marketplace. So if we look then at the next slide, there we go. So the idea is that we're looking at the capabilities of the national labs to begin with. The EMN is offering as on the slide says, a flexible consortium model to address some of the key materials challenges, but across many different clean energy applications. Now, some of the services that the EMN consortia will offer is a enhanced stakeholder engagement with the national laboratory systems that have these resources. How do people find the right resource in their particular technology application? How do they get to the national laboratory system and navigate through that to know what's the best tool set for them to leverage in terms of their technology development? And then how do they engage with the national labs quickly and effectively? There's many levels on that, which we'll come to in upcoming slides, related to not only how do you get hooked up with the right technology experts, but how do you engage with the right agreements and the streamlined access to NDAs and technology transfer mechanisms. We'll come back to that again in the remaining slides. The point is that the EMN does have guiding principles that we'll talk about in the next few slides, but there is flexibility enough to accommodate the fact that there's such a broad spectrum of technologies that are under investigation in the clean energy space. All right, so to the requirements then, what does an Energy Materials Network Consortium look like? We're starting out, it's a curation or it's an accumulation of national laboratory resources, and the 4 pillars that we've added to EMN, in addition to the basic MGI foundational pillars, are listed on this slide. I'll go through them very quickly. Each EMN consortium must offer a world-class network. Now, we'll talk about this again. What does that mean? It's unique. It's the resources and the expertise that qualify that as a unique world-class materials resource capability. We'll keep coming back to that. One of the other things that we recognize is that we needed to offer the EMN consortia. Each one has to offer clear points of engagement for this ease of access for stakeholder engagement, so they know who to talk to. They can be directed to the right technical experts. to help engage in the process of developing their material systems. That's very important. We also realize that the big data, which is a part of MGI, also has to be dealt with appropriately in the EMN. The data collaboration framework is very important, that each EMN has to adhere to the MGI principles, but we realize that data is different across these consortia. There's data in terms of computational materials data, there's data in terms of experimentally derived data, screening data. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of information that's going to have to be curated and organized in an efficient way. There's no prescribed way of doing that across the EMNs, but there's guiding principles that we are setting up to make sure that best practices are being leveraged and utilized across the board. And perhaps one of the more interesting and maybe one of the more important things to address early on is the streamlined access. A lot of people who have worked with the national labs in academia and industry realize that getting agreements in place to do any type of research and development can take quite a lot of effort and quite a lot of time. Streamlined access, including NDAs, rapid CRADAs, other types of agreements. We want to make sure that we're keeping track of best practices in this area. We're curating a documentation library of successful CRADAs, NDAs, etc. The EMN will be sharing best practices across the board and making sure that as we roll out the consortia, that these documents are available to streamline access to all of the consortia for their stakeholders. Okay, getting through pretty quickly. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. I just want to spend a little time on each of the 4 pillars that I've just described. The first part is this capabilities network itself. I'm going to spend a little time on the word you probably see when you start investigating the websites for the EMN consortia. We call it a node. It may be an unfortunate term, but it is what it is. It's important to realize that a node is a unique capability that's offered through the EMN consortia at the National Laboratory Systems, and it's not only a tool, but it doesn't involve tools such as microscope, etc., or it could be a software set. It also involves a technique or a methodology that's been specifically applied to the application space of interest, the technology space of interest. But as I keep saying, the people and the expertise who know how to use this tool and who can engage with the stakeholders to use it effectively, that's the important thing. So a node itself is all of the above. And importantly, the EMN has developed a way of evaluating the nodes that qualify for the EMN. And how this is being done is through a steering committee, which we'll talk about in the next several slides as well, that the national laboratories and DOE has formulated a steering committee that's the organizational structure for each particular consortium. And the steering committee is comprised of experts from each of the participating labs. And there's a really rigorous peer review process that goes over all of the proposed nodes that are coming to the network, saying, do these qualify as a node in terms of these 3 categories that we've described? Is it a tool? Is there a technique? And is it expertise? Is it unique? Does it really qualify to be a part of the EMN as a resource and not just a microscope that anyone could use anywhere else? So it's a big deal to know what that node definition is. It keeps coming back to it. Again, it's not just a tool. It's a tool, a methodology, and most importantly, an expertise. All right. So keeping on, I think the next thing, I think I'm going backwards here. There we go. Right, so the next point then is the clear points of contact. That's an important thing as well. These won't be handled exactly the same in every consortium, but there's an idea that there's a concierge, a single point of contact that an external stakeholder, such as from industry, academia, or from another national lab, can contact the consortium to see who the right people are, who are the right nodes in that consortium that might be appropriate for leveraging in terms of a specific research topic. So we're developing this. It'll be a little bit different for each of the consortium itself, but the point is that that no one has to go and try to contact each individual laboratory to figure this out. There is a concierge service that will help make this happen. Not only that, it's intended to add transparency to the system, because all of these engagements with the concierge are available to the steering committee, which is comprised of participating laboratory experts. Everyone sees the questions that are coming in. Everyone gets to have an input on how to address those, who to match make the stakeholder with in terms of the specific nodes that are available at their laboratories. So this is an interesting idea. That matchmaking actually has to happen when industry starts to come with materials problems for specific applications, how do they really get into the National Laboratory System? We think that this concierge system is a very effective and interesting way to do it. It also gives an opportunity to, through the web services, do a lot more outreach, really socialize what's available in the consortium itself. And as we mentioned in previous slides, and we'll come back to again, we believe that this will also help us facilitate some of these contract agreements and also facilitate the data management process. All right. Okay, I think we're moving forward the correct way. Again, now I'm going to come back to this again. I think a lot of people who have worked in research and development, both from the fundamental all the way through the applied side, even into technology development and demonstration, realize that there's a lot of problems when you start to mix and match and you try to get industry working with national labs and with academia. In terms of the contracting, non-disclosure agreements, the CRADAs, all of the above, can be challenging. One of the important things that the EMN, as a system of EMNs, is doing is leveraging lessons learned from each time we've gone through this. We'll be putting together a documents library of successful contracts, successful CRADAs. We will be using exploratory licenses whenever possible, but I think it's very important to understand that we're focused on this very importantly. That we realize that this can be a bottleneck. If we're trying to accelerate the materials to market process, we can't be sitting on top of these agreements for 2 years waiting for them to really be formulated. So as important as the technology discovery is, as important as the matchmaking with the technology experts is, we feel that it's equally important to really matchmake everyone in the consortium with the appropriate tech-to-market advisors. And we'll show that that's why we're really engaging specifically with those experts at the National Laboratory Systems as a part of the EMN construct. All right, on to the fourth one, the data management. Again, I do want to highlight that it's very important that we manage computational experimental data information. This is all important for accelerating the research and development process. As I've mentioned before, each EMN or each application-specific EMN will have a lot of different requirements on the type of data they'll be generating and curating. Again, the point is to have a generalized structure, framework of guidance that's not overly prescriptive. The point is that the EMN will really require consistency with the broader MGI vision for data and information, but it does provide flexibility because we recognize that there's such a diverse set of data and information that will be required across the board. So again, how we're doing this is we're looking at best practices in terms of structuring data portals, in terms of how we manage specific types of experimental outputs, specific types of computational outputs. And, especially then when we start to get into combinatorial synthesis and rapid screening, the amount of data becomes enormous. We have to make sure that we're extracting information from it effectively. Looking at techniques to do that is a part of the EMN and the MGI as well. But the key thing is that we also don't want to start from scratch. We recognize that a lot of good work has happened in this area over the past several years in terms of a lot of other data repositories that are out there specifically focusing on materials research and development. We want to make sure that our generalized structure takes advantage of those, but also provides another set of capabilities that are unique to the EMN in terms of the best practices that we share and the guidances that we put together and move forward with. All right, so again, I'll come back then to this idea of kind of the consortium steering committee to make sure that there is transparency in all the activities that the EMN is engaged with. We realize that not only do we need technological capabilities experts from each of the labs who are participating in a given consortium, we also need tech transfer experts as well as data experts. And each consortium is required to bring to the table these 3 experts, which then form a part of this broader consortium steering committee. We have aggressive engagement with the steering committee on many fronts to make sure that we're getting the lessons learned transferred across the board, and we're also using them to engage in these node evaluation, capability node evaluations, along with a lot of other things. So if you're in the consortium now, you realize that this has been taking a lot of our time recently. As we get developed, these lessons learned, it'll become a more streamlined process. But the key point is that there's also transparency here, that each of the labs has access to all of the engagements that are happening across the board with the external stakeholders, so that they're able not only to direct the inquiries to the right place within their own labs, but we'll also see have this transparency that everyone's on a fair playing field in terms of how we move forward. All right, I think that might be an interesting point. We'll get some more questions on that one, I believe, as well. Let's see, I got to get to the next slide here. Sorry, guys. There we go. All right, so in general, if we take a step back, we'll see that I'll show you the consortia that are actually been developed already in a few slides, but we're really looking at the EMN as this network of consortia that are sharing best practices and specifically looking for ways to enhance the stakeholder engagements. And I know one of the key ways to do that is through funding opportunities, funding pathways. The two major pathways that I'm showing on this particular chart in terms of the broad EMN network are the FOA types of funding opportunities, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But there are also ways of, again, having rapid agreements, work for others. All of these opportunities are specifically peer reviewed to make sure that there's transparency in this, and that'll go through the steering committees as well as shown on this slide. What I'm going to do is spend the next slide looking at a specific type of funding opportunity that will be of interest probably to this community, since we have this notice of intent out in the Fuel Cell Technologies Office. That involves funding related to 3 specific EMN consortia. We'll see that the FOA pathway is very important. Again, that's competitive funding to work with the consortia. There'll be a peer review process, as always, looking for competitively selected projects in innovative materials research and development, but specifically looking for projects that can leverage the EMN consortia resource capabilities. And I just want to highlight that if we look at these funding modalities that are shown on this slide, the second one is the highlight, which is I think most of our people are familiar with. The consortia full partnered support really highlights the fact that the laboratory resources themselves are being funded through a separate mechanism. So when industry or academia comes to the table with proposals to leverage these resources at the national laboratories, they're not on the hook to fund those resources themselves. There's a separate mechanism to make sure that the resources that are of high value and high demand get the sufficient funding and support to keep them operational with the tool sets, the methodologies, and the expertise all intact. All right, so taking another step back, then I'll kind of try to finish things up and give us a little time for Q&A. As I've mentioned before, there's a broader EMN framework going on here that we're trying to really leverage lessons learned. I do want to give a call out to the 4 initial pilot projects that were started since February, those being LightMat, which is for lightweight materials research and development out of the Vehicle Technologies Office in EERE, the ElectroCat Consortium, which is for non-PGM catalyst development for fuel cells out of the Fuel Cell Technologies Office at EERE, the Caloricool Consortium, which is looking at caloric materials, which is coming out of EERE's Building Technologies Office as well as AMO, and the Duramat Consortium, EMN Consortium on durable module materials, which is being funded out of the EERE Solar Energy Technologies Office. Again, these are the first 4, and I'll show you that since February there's several more that have rolled out, which you'll be interested in. But the idea is that we're all talking together, we're all doing lessons learned. I've mentioned it several times before. We're trying to categorize and organize these efforts in a way that helps us really accelerate the R&D process across the board for all of EERE and all of clean energy technology applications. Now, I'm just going to throw this up as a little colorful infographic that was put together by EERE. It summarizes a lot of the things I've discussed so far in terms of the Energy Materials Network, including the 4 pilot projects, the key pillars, the foundations of the EMN, and it puts it in kind of a fast-moving train graphic that shows us that there's a lot of momentum coming into this and moving forward with this. And just to support that momentum, I want to highlight the fact that since February, of the 4 pilot projects that had the 4 pilot consortia that were launched, 3 additional consortia have been launched. Those include the ChemCat Bio Consortium out of the EERE Biotechnology Office, the Hydrogen Consortium out of EERE's Fuel Cell Technologies Office, as well as the HIMARC Consortium also out of Fuel Cell Technologies Office. And I'll give you a little more details on those in the next few slides, but I do want to highlight that since February a lot has happened. Many consortia have been rolled out, and they're engaged actively in specific funding opportunities at this time. For your information, if you want to keep up on this on the EMN Consortia, the latest ones, I really highly recommend you to go to the DOE's Energy Materials Network website, which I've shown here. It's a little bit out of date. I think it started with the 4 pilots. We're trying to get the next 3 on there as soon as possible, so you have more information on those. But I will do say every launched EMN consortium has its own website that you should be aware of as well. And what I'm going to do is spend the next 2 or 3 minutes just focusing on the Fuel Cell Technologies Office, EMN Consortia, because these will be the topics of FOA support that are coming up that were announced in the NOI recently. You know about the ElectroCAD. I've mentioned that as a PGM-free catalysis. Highmark was a consortium, but is now being folded into the EMN network. Again, that's looking for materials-based hydrogen storage. And the Hydrogen Consortium has also been rolled out recently, which is looking at water-splitting materials for renewable hydrogen production. And all 3 of these consortia will have topics related to them and the FOA that will be coming out of the Fuel Cell Technologies Office. I encourage you to go to each of the websites. I'm showing here some of the capabilities available or at the ElectroCAD Consortium. These are pretty well laid out if you go to the ElectroCAD website itself. At this point, we're really encouraging researchers to investigate what capabilities are out there so they can identify key resources that they could leverage in the research and development as moving forward into this opportunity for funding in research under the topic that you will see when it comes out. Again, the Highmark has a good website that just came out recently as well. They will give you a good opportunity to look at what's being done in the hydrogen materials storage materials realm and see how you would be able to engage with this consortium in terms of possible funding opportunities in a FOA topic. And lastly, I'm going to highlight the Hydrogen Consortium, which also has compiled a lot of resource capabilities that you should explore at your leisure. And I'll spend a little time, one more slide on the Hydrogen Consortium, because it does highlight a very important fact that not all nodes are really created equally. If you go to the Hydrogen Consortium, you'll see that they've categorized their resource nodes as 1, 2, and 3, depending on, are they plug and play? Are they pretty much ready to use now? Is more research and development needed to take those tools up to the point where they're really seriously looking at water splitting applications? This is an important thing for researchers to be aware of as well. Each consortium has different levels of node readiness level that you should be familiar with, because it will depend on how long it will take to get that thing up to speed, what type of resources are needed. I think that is an important and subtle point that I'm expecting to get some questions on. But what I do want to highlight is that you will have more opportunities specifically with both the ElectroCAD and the Highmark, the spelling here, I apologize, the Highmark webinars, which are happening tomorrow, as well as 3 separate Hydrogen Consortium webinars that are broken into the specific technology focus areas of photoelectrochemistry, electrolysis, and thermochemistry, solar thermochemistry over the next several weeks. So this is the end of my overview of EMN. I expect a lot of interesting questions here, but I expect mostly to see that you'll have a lot of questions related to the specific topics in the 3 consortia for Fuel Cell Technologies Office. So thank you for paying attention. And I'm going to open the floor for questions now.
Okay, this is Ben Clark, and I have a few questions that I can read off. We can start going. We only have a few, so please feel free to put your questions in the question mark, and they'll pop up. Eric, let's start out with the establishment of the EMN, particularly for the FCTO. Will FOAs now require the use of the EMN and collaboration with one or more of the national labs, or will there be other FOAs that don't involve the EMN?
Right. So you'll see that a FOA topic will specifically call out whether it's an EMN-related topic. And those topics, the point is really to engage with the resources that are available as much as possible today, instead of building them up from scratch, if at all possible. We're looking for creative ideas. We're looking for innovation that can take advantage of the resources that are either available today or under development today. So I think the simple answer is yes, there are other topics that come out of the office that will not be EMN related, but those that are will specifically be called out as an EMN type topic.
Okay. So has the EMN staff engaged with users of these nodes in developing the EMN in terms, is this process responsive and effective, and is it a good model to use? And in the future, how will you engage these users of the nodes in the future?
Right. That's a great question. The process of developing the nodes, identifying the nodes, evaluating the nodes, and qualifying them as EMN nodes, it has been pretty rigorous. It has involved the national laboratories. All the PIs were welcome to propose nodes, for participating laboratories that are in the consortium. The steering committee looked at them all under the categories of uniqueness, all the categories we talked about. The point is that these will be evaluated on a regular basis as they get developed and as new ones come to the table. We're having a rigorous peer review process, but a part of that is to really look at the stakeholder engagement with the nodes themselves to see which are most successful. There's going to be a lot of stakeholder engagement in terms of workshops, webinars associated with each consortium and probably associated with the broad EMN as a whole. To bring these best practices to the table so we can understand really how these things are best being used, how are they best being defined, and how can this be, the definition of a node be refined and expanded to make it more effective for stakeholder engagement.
Okay. Is it a requirement to work with capability nodes?
Right. Again, this somewhat goes back to the first question. And this is where, what we're really asking the research community to think about is that, if we're looking at a specific materials research project for a specific application, either in HIMARC or hydrogen or electrocat in our cases, from Fuel Cell Technologies office, what don't you have that, that could really help identify or benchmark or qualify your idea much faster than you would be able to do if you had to start from scratch on that? We believe that the nodes that we're putting together in these consortia really can add a lot to that. We think that it really should accelerate the process by making these resources, capability resources available on an easier basis for stakeholders to engage with. So the point of an EMN topic then really will be to show how innovative ideas can be qualified, can be move the ball faster, further by engaging with specific laboratory, at this point, EMN consortia capabilities, and that's going to be a part of the proposal. Is how do you envision this happening? Again, the point is that nobody has the everything that they need to do effective materials research and development in terms of data, bandwidth, in terms of expertise, in terms of experimentation, in terms of computation. Looking at this as more of a distributed across the nation, even across the world ultimately, we believe that by really pulling these things to the table, there's an opportunity to leverage these capabilities and not really compete them out, but really to leverage them to really accelerate innovations in the materials marketplace.
Okay, there's a couple of questions about engaging with the national labs during the FOA process. What level of communication can they have there? Is it true that they cannot engage with the national labs, or must you go through the steering committee?
Right, and I don't know, if Neha's on the line, since she's helping us run the FOA at this point, I may ask her to put a few words in there. I can start out by saying that will be clear in the FOA itself, the language related to this. Again, this will evolve with best practices. It certainly is an intent for the EMN in the long run to engage communications and to enhance communications. Within the FOA process itself, we have to be very careful in terms of legalities, in terms of communications while a FOA is open, for example. That will be spelled out very clearly in any FOA that is released. However, I do want to highlight that the big picture over the course of the year when there are not FOAs out there is that community building and stakeholder engagement building is an important part of the EMN as it is for MGI. So, and year-wide engagement between the research communities and the national laboratories will be encouraged. When the FOA is out, there's a different set of rules that need to be followed there, and that tends to be incommunicado. But I don't know if Neha wants to fill in a little bit more there.
Sure. So the steering committees of these consortia, as everybody's probably aware, they're formed of technical experts that have done research in this space before, and they've served as both leads and subcontractors on projects before. So before the FOA is released, we really encourage you to reach out to them and get their feedback on the types of research that you're looking to collaborate with them on in the same way that you would if you were engaging with a subcontractor. And usually those conversations will go into a lot more detail than what an applicant would be interested in discussing in a public forum. But once the FOA comes out, all communication related to the FOA has to be public. So any questions have to go through a publicly available FAQs website that we'll be setting up that's associated with the FOA. So that's what we meant by communication with the steering committee being managed based on when the FOA comes out. Prior to the FOA coming out, we don't need to be keeping record of the communications that you're having, and we don't need to be publicizing them. And you can have whatever communications that are confidential, but it's because once the FOA comes out, everything has to be public. For that reason, we encourage you to reach out to the steering committee beforehand, and we have to restrict communications thereafter.
Thank you. I think that that's very helpful. And again, everyone pay attention to the language in the FOA and the language in the NOIs. These should make things pretty clear. Again, but when the FOA is not open, when any FOA is not open, we do encourage this type of engagement between stakeholders and researchers and the national laboratories to help us evolve. What are the best collaborative opportunities?
Okay. Right now, it looks like most of the nodes and tools are from national laboratories. Do you envision in the future nodes being added that are not from national laboratories?
That's a great question, and that comes up quite a bit as well. The model that we started with to really roll this thing out really was focused on the capabilities that we have at the national laboratory systems, recognizing that DOE has invested a lot in these capabilities, and we wanted to make sure that they're being leveraged in a most effective way. We also recognize that, specifically if we look across the board at the application space, there's all sorts of interesting, great new tools that are out there that have been developed that really could fit into this whole MGI vision, either computationally, experimentally, high throughput screening, combinatorial synthesis. We know there's a lot out there. Moving forward, we're really hoping to engage a lot of these capabilities. How they actually get folded as specific nodes is still to be determined, but we are paying attention to that and keeping an eye on that because we do recognize the value of these resources outside of the national laboratory system as well.
How would a potential applicant engage with labs that are outside of the consortia in developing a proposal?
Okay, maybe we'll have to interpret the question a little bit here. Again, you might have to wait to see what the FOA language is in terms of the eligibility requirements, in terms of who can propose to specific FOA topics. Depending on what you see there, you would engage with them as you would on any other FOA topic. Just make sure that you're adhering to the guidance that's in the FOA. And I don't know, Neha, do you have any additional information on that we can share at this point? Yeah, I think not. I'm guessing not. I think we have to be very careful to really pay attention to how do you normally work with the laboratories. If they're not in the consortium, there are ways to work with them. You can discuss with them. Pay attention to what the eligibility requirements are when the FOA comes out, and that should clarify things quite considerably. Anything else, Ben, you got?
Yeah, there's a couple here. I guess how do new EMN become developed? For example, technologies for biomass or municipal solid waste to hydrogen. How does one decide when an EMN is developed, and how will new consortia be developed in the future?
That's another very good question. We have a pretty good group on the DOE that's really engaged in this, and there's been a lot of support across the board. We have a lot of high-level EERE officials that really have made this happen. And really it's up to the offices at EERE, for example, to really put forward what they believe are the most, our high-impact EMN consortia, where the EMN model really could help move forward the ball in terms of materials development for their application space. So we're talking about that internally. Again, we're looking for stakeholder engagement at all costs. We're doing as many workshops and RFIs as possible to really identify where the high impact areas for this are. But I will say that if you look not only at EERE or DOE, many places across the country and across the world. This consortium approach is actually kind of picking up, realizing, I think, that like I've mentioned, that not every, no one has all the capabilities they need. And if you really look, specifically if you're looking at a technology that you really want to develop or push forward, there's very specific capabilities that are necessary that you may not have, but a consortium approach is very important. Bringing these to the table and proposing them as EMN within the, the constraints of what the funding might be or what the priorities might be. That's how it's being rolled out at DOE, but of course stakeholder engagement to really help bring home what the priority areas are is always helpful to us. But this is an ongoing discussion we have across DOE in terms of the EMN development. What is the next great EMN to come out? And I think we've got an interesting, a lot of excitement going on behind that. So we see these 7 that are out now where people are already talking about the next generation of EMNs.
Okay, and are there any specific incentives for the DOE labs or nodes to work with academia or industry?
Right. So I mentioned a bit that, again, the use of the node, we're looking for partnerships, collaborations, we're looking for funding of innovative ideas through these collaborative partnerships. And that'll be, one of the examples is through the FOA process itself. Within that FOA process, as I've mentioned, the resource capability nodes at the laboratories that are being exercised or leveraged in those programs have a separate mechanism by which development and support is given. So that's one aspect of that. Again, if you look at that node readiness level that I talked about briefly, that we'll see that there's some capabilities that are really exciting and people have a lot of opportunities to leverage them, but they may need additional development, or they may have been developed for one technology area but will require some new expertise to bring them up to speed in terms of a different technology area. The question then becomes how engaged is the community with those? How do we prioritize those so they will require some additional support to get them up to speed? Now, like I say, each consortium is different. We'll see if you go on, and I really highly encourage everyone to explore the whole space of EMN websites at this point. If you look at the LightMat website, for example, there's a lot of resource capabilities that are available across the board. Almost every laboratory has some. But they're mostly what I would call that category 1, where they're available to the public, and it's really a matter of putting them together. They don't require a lot of additional support or funding to bring them up or to do any tool development. That's an interesting, one case where high TRL technologies are really just looking for benchmarking capabilities or other very specific, unique capabilities. That's a little different from what we'll see, for example, in ElectroCat, where a lot of these innovative new nodes that are being developed for fuel cells in terms of non-PGM or PGM-free catalysis really have evolved out of other projects, other programs, and are bringing the expertise in terms of fuel cells to the table. So there's a little bit more of a developmental effort in those, so that they take a little different resource requirement. So kind of looking at what your application space is, where the nodes are, is an important thing to pay attention to. And I think I'm starting to lose track of what the question was, but I think the answer is that using them is important, and some will require more resources than others. And if that's you, Ben, stop typing. So.
That was me. Apologies.
Okay. All right. Okay. What else do we got?
Do we have any information on the timeline of the FOA?
Soon. Naya, do you have anything more concrete than that?
Sorry, but yeah, just stay tuned.
Stay tuned. There you go. All right. I can see a few here. There was actually, I noticed there was a JCAP-related question I wanted to bring to the table. Okay. So I do want to bring up JCAP as well. JCAP, for those who are not familiar, is the Energy Innovation Hub, the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis, that spent a lot of time in areas related to the hydrogen consortium, which is important to note. There's a lot of photoelectrochemical-based hydrogen production, materials research that was fundamental, foundational to JCAP in its first phase, and a lot of equipment, a lot of resource development, a lot of expertise development that we're paying very careful attention to in terms of how we leverage those and bring them into the fold for the EMN Consortium for Hydrogen. We believe that this is a great example of a very successful handoff of work that's been supported by DOE in the past and lessons learned, and we're really excited that we're having an opportunity to do that. So I do want to highlight that from the hydrogen perspective in terms of the water splitting materials, but we're also looking forward to do that, across the board in the EMNs. All of the DOE investments that we're very proud of and very excited about, we're really looking for opportunities to leverage as best as possible, transitioning into the applied fields of the EMN research and development. Anything else, Ben? I think we do have quite a lot of questions here.
Yeah, there's a few redundant here. I'm trying to filter them out. One second. What about funding for the development of nodes or the expansions of node capabilities? Does that come from the FOA, or does that money come directly from DOE to the lab?
Again, I'm just maybe interpreting here a bit. The support of the nodes that are being used by projects that are competitively selected and supported does come separately to the labs themselves. Again, that'll be, if we're looking at what categories of node readiness level, that'll be depending on the topic itself, what the priorities are in terms of utilizing the available nodes at the readiness level 1 versus others. That, again, that'll be topic specific. And there may be, again, the resources needed to support a node at a lower category would be more likely to be more than for a higher level category.
Just can I just add to that? So just to make it just to clarify, so any funding associated with the use of the consortium is separate from the funding that's associated with the FOA. So the funding associated with the FOA that goes to an applicant or a recipient is not for the use of the consortium. That's being handled through a different stream at DOE.
Okay, thanks Neha. I see one question about white papers that may be concept papers. Will there be white papers before the full proposals? I'm guessing that's a concept paper question. I believe, Neha, you could address that, or is that still too early?
What's the question?
Will there be a concept paper phase for the FOAs, or will it go straight to the proposals, or should we wait till the FOA comes out and
yeah, we're going to have to wait till the FOA comes out for that one.
There'll be a lot of answers like that. We apologize ahead of time, but that's how we do it. Let's see, I'm going through the questions. Okay, that's good. I think we're covering a lot there. Like as Ben has mentioned, there's a lot of common questions that I think we've. Well, there's a few more. Let me. Is it favorable to have industrial partners? Again, industry stakeholder engagement is certainly desirable. We're really trying to get things to the marketplace. Industry partners, when appropriate for a specific topic, are obviously encouraged, again, but really we're looking for innovations that can really bring together industry or academia with the national laboratory resources to help move things forward. So it's a good question, but industrial partners are, in many cases, depending on the topic itself, very, very encouraged. All right. Yeah, I'm going through this. Okay, good. We're going through. Ben, do you have any others that we haven't addressed yet?
Let's see here.
I see one that relates to the Hydrogen Consortium. I think there's some specific ones. I do encourage everyone to tune into the specific webinars on those consortia to get more detailed information. So, for example, there's a question related to any nodes at the Hydrogen Consortium that support the type 1 or 2 particle-based PEC systems. Again, this is materials research and development. Anything that's looking at an absorber or a catalyst or an interface could conceivably be applied to an electrode system or a particle system. Whether or not that the researcher comes to the table with that in mind will depend on how those nodes are being utilized. I don't know if that's the gist of the question, but I think that's true, and I think I encourage you to tune into the Hydrogen Consortium webinar on photoelectric chemistry to get more detailed information on that.
Eric, can you comment on the number of nodes that should be utilized, or is there a limit on the number of nodes that should be proposed or utilized?
Right. That's also a very good question, and again, there's no set answer on this, but just keep in mind that we're really looking for collaborations. So if we find that people are proposing using a lot of national laboratory nodes, at what point does that become less of innovation on their part and more just a national laboratory innovation by itself? So we're really looking for people to be very, very clever on how they could utilize the resources in the national laboratories to enhance or to qualify or to benchmark or to prove their scientific innovation. Again, the more nodes you're putting in from the labs, the less it might be construed as your innovation, but that's certainly not constrained. There may be several different nodes that could either help you with your computation of your materials or the screening of your materials or the characterization. That really would be very powerful in addition to the innovations you're proposing. Really keeping in mind that you will not be, that the laboratory nodes themselves will be funded on a separate stream, but there's not, an infinite bandwidth to be funding many, all of them for everybody. If you're putting together, basically a way to really have the laboratories do most of the work, that would be a little bit of a might not be viewed that favorably, but I think it'll be a balancing act between the resources available, how to best leverage what's available now, and what is the biggest bang for the buck in terms of utilizing what's out there at the national laboratories that currently are being advertised in the EMN networks themselves, and help us evolve them as we move forward to see how we make them better. So I'm sorry I can't give you a number on that, but I really encourage all of the researchers to keep that in mind, that we're really looking at for really clever leveraging and innovation in terms of how to best utilize the available resources to the best advantage.
And a similar question, but you might have the same answer. How are the node readiness levels, particularly for hydrogen, weighted, and how would you go about proposing nodes with different node readiness levels? For example, if you had a bunch of nodes that were already ready, or if you had one node that needed a lot of work, will that come into the evaluation?
Right, so I mean a couple of parts of that question. One is that the way they're evaluated or decided is with the steering committee through a peer evaluation process of the node themselves. I encourage you to look at explore them on the website. What you'll see is that there actually could be some interesting characterization or computational nodes that have been developed, for example, for electrolysis, for example, which might be a node readiness level 1 in that category, but could have really exciting applications to catalysis for PEC, for example. But that would then you'd see that be listed as maybe a category 2 instead of a category 1 in that field. So I think we are looking for cross-germination as well. I mean, if we see there's opportunities to leverage something that's pretty well developed in one area, but will require additional work, to really high impact outputs, that could be an interesting thing to pay attention to. But we really are looking for, the researchers to really identify those and to see how important that will be. Again, we're really looking for leveraging and looking for the best outcomes for that leveraging, within what we the peer evaluation allows. But these will all be a part of the criteria that will come to the table, and we'll see what we get in. And we really can't prescribe that. We really are looking for innovation in terms of how people are best utilizing what's available in the consortia to the best outcomes. I know I danced around that a little bit, but I think it's important. It's important to understand that this is evolving, and as the technologies evolve, the nodes will evolve, and the consortia will evolve, and we'll be learning from each other. And we feel like after we go through one round of funding opportunities, we're going to have a good opportunity to go back and look at what are the key access to specific capabilities that really had the biggest impact, and that'll help us as a steering committee for each consortium and across the EMN to help us prioritize where we really think the future priorities should be. All right, anything else?
Maybe one housekeeping, and this might be for Chris. Where can we find the slides for downloading? Will they be available?
Yeah, Eric, do you have that last slide that maybe has the hydrogen and fuel cells?
Sure. So let's go there.
On it there. Okay, great. Yeah, everyone, you can download these slides and also watch a recording of the webinar at the website shown there. That's hydrogenandfuelcells.energy.gov. The slides should be available in about a day or two, and the webinar will be posted in about 10 days. I'm going to send out an email to everyone that's registered to the webinar. And in that email, you'll receive some instructions on how to download the slides from there. I guess a little further, just to tag on to Eric alluded to some upcoming webinars for the different consortia. That's ElectroCat, Highmark, and Hydrogen. Over the next 2 weeks, I think we're going to be holding a number of webinars covering each of those consortia. And a good place to go to, I'm sorry I don't have it up on the screen here, but if you want to register for any of those webinars, a good website to go to here is it's www.energy.gov/EERE/fuel-cells/webinars. Again, that's energy.gov/EERE/fuel-cells/webinars, and there you can sign up for all the various WAB Consortia webinars we're going to be holding in about 2 weeks. I'll try and include that information in an email out to everyone once I notify them that these slides are posted.
All right, thanks, Chris. I think that kind of addresses most of the questions that have come in specific on the general part of EMN. I think I encourage everyone to really log into the specific webinars on the specific consortia coming up to get more detailed information.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for tuning in. We'll look for you to attend some of the future webinars. And Eric, is there a website specific to EMN or anything, or a contact?
Sure.
Email address?
Let me go back to that slide. There you go. The general EMN website is shown on this slide at www.energy.gov, EERE Energy Materials Network /Energy Materials Network. I'm not sure why we need it twice, but there you go. That should get you to this site. It'll link you up to the consortia websites themselves, although we're trying to update that as well. I do want to, I think maybe I can bring up, okay, now this is the registration for the specific webinars as well, but I'd say go to Chris's website that he mentioned, and that'll link you into these specific registration sites for the upcoming webinars this week and next.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Well, everyone have a great rest of your week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Chris. Bye-bye.